Um, Hi everyone, this is Mohamed Elshahed, about to do a live event for AUC Press about the book Cairo Since 1900. We'll just wait a few minutes until people tune in. So I hope you stick around just a few more minutes. I hope everyone is doing well and is healthy. Confirm if the sound is okay. Please feel free to comment below with any questions about the book or about architecture in Egypt or in Cairo, modernism. I'm happy to respond to those questions. But this is our main topic for today, the book Cairo Since 1900. And just waiting a few more minutes for people to tune in. And thank you for joining the live chat today. Oh, great, good to hear that the sound is working. Great, so maybe I should start right away. Hi, my name is Mohamed Elshahed. I'm a curator, a writer, independent researcher focused on architecture, design, and material culture of 20th century Egypt. I have just published this book, Cairo Since 1900, with the American University in Cairo Press. I'm very proud of this. It's been a project of about 5 years of work. We've received many questions, or some questions that I'd like to respond to and sort of use to shape the conversation today. Basically, we'll be talking for about 35 to 45 minutes, introducing the book briefly, but also spending as much time as possible responding to your questions. So the book is kind of a survey. It's an architectural survey in the sense that it chronicles a selection of architectural examples from 20th century Cairo, 1900 to the present. And it includes 226 buildings arranged geographically in 17 sort of areas. They're not necessarily correlating to specific neighborhoods. For example, we have downtown as its own section, but in some cases, different districts are combined together, like say the Zainab and Abdeen. And the idea is really to provide a succinct and accessible overview of the architectural production since 1900 till today in Cairo, which is a huge challenge. The book includes 226 buildings. In my opinion, it's a drop sort of in the ocean, but at the same time, those buildings are really important for us to think about Cairo's significance in terms of its architectural history, but also to highlight the fact that we're losing so much given the lack of a sort of a restoration-oriented architectural practice and sort of a legal framework that encourages the maintenance and restoration of buildings. So the book is in many ways, on one hand, it's a survey that makes accessible sort of a selection of buildings from Cairo's vast geography and history, but it is also designed to be accessible in the sense that it's a guide that allows you to navigate the city by walking around to explore the buildings. Let me just run you through the organization of the book really quickly. So it starts with an introduction that sort of gives a historical context to the development of modern architecture in Egypt in general, but specifically in Cairo. And I should make this distinction quite clear that Cairo is not Egypt. So not only is this a drop in the bucket of sort of Egypt's architectural production in the last century or more, but it does not really represent what happened across the entire country. So there's a lot more work to be done, and I hope that this will encourage many others to identify buildings, to record them, and hopefully to publish about them from across the country as essential pieces of Egypt's patrimony and urban history. So after the introduction that contextualizes everything, there's a maps section, and I encourage everyone to visit Cairo Since 1900.com, which is a website created for the book. You can access it if you have the book by scanning the QR code, or you can go to Cairo Since 1900.com. And from there, there's a very useful function, which is related to maps. Two-dimensional maps are provided in the book to give a general overview. However, the GPS locations for all the individual buildings are listed with each building's entry. And through the website, you can select the building if it still exists and is still standing. And by choosing it from the website, you can go to the Google Maps location from which you can then navigate your way to the building. So each building is given a page. Sometimes it's a spread, but oftentimes it's a page where you get the essential information about the building, its name. Often the name that was used in the book is the name of the original patron. So for example, if it's an apartment building built in the 1930s and we know the name of the patron, sometimes buildings were given names. For example, Zamalek has a beautiful apartment building called Dar El Hana that was actually inscribed, in the building facade. So the building was given a name, but in most cases, buildings are usually named after their original patron. Of course, with the change of owners over the years due to many sometimes usual, but in many cases unusual circumstances such as sequestration, nationalization, and so on, the continuous link of ownership has been sort of severed several times. So it's difficult to identify who the original owner is, and therefore what to name the building. So the naming game is itself quite interesting. Another example perhaps is this building here, which was demolished in 2015 when this book started. I would say it was a catalyst for the making of this book. And the building was the headquarters of the National Democratic Party, right next to the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square. It was a very controversial demolition, but I think it really was one of those moments that highlighted the urgency for documenting and safeguarding modernist architecture for its historical value as much as its aesthetic contribution to the city. So this building is interesting, for example, in terms of naming, because it's had multiple lives. And this is the case with buildings quite often, is that it's never really a single use across its history or a single function across its history. It changes. This building was designed by Mahmoud Riyad and completed in keep going to the other page. In 1958, as Cairo's municipality. The municipality was actually cancelled, and this is when we shifted back to the sort of governorate structure for taking care of Cairo. And the building became the headquarters of the Arab Socialist Union, Nasser's political party. And then later on during Sadat and Mubarak, it became the National Democratic Party. So which one do we name it? Is it the municipality? Is it the Arab Socialist Union? Is it the National Democratic Party? It is all of the above. In this particular case, the naming went to Arab Socialist Party, since this was really its first significant use. The municipality was very short-lived. And so the building's main function was really to be the headquarters of the National Socialist Union. So besides the names of the different buildings, which might be interesting for people to look at, and please take a look, for example, for how many names of buildings are named after their patrons, and how many of those patrons are women. I think this is quite a significant point that I make in the book, which is highlighting how, while women were not so much present in the architectural profession in Egypt, as in many other places, how architecture is such a masculine discipline. But despite this, in the case of Cairo, women were very present in questions of patronage, for example, and how they commissioned and funded many of the buildings included here. So you get the address, the GPS location, the year, and lastly, the name of the architect. One of the things that I think is really important to consider with this book is not only to add to what we think we know about the history of modernism, but also to challenge some of its conventions, such as the focus on architects as sort of the architect as genius and sort of the architect being placed at the very top of the narrative about the built environment. This book doesn't really replicate this. In fact, and this may also have to do with the specific Egyptian context for how architecture as a profession developed in Egypt. But this is not a book about super architects. And I think this is sort of an art historical model that's been quite easy to adapt for many places, but it's really focused on the architectural production of Western countries where architects played a particular role in the public sphere. This is not necessarily what we see in a place like Egypt. After this, you get sort of the concise description of the building, its physical attributes. It's a bit technical. It focuses a bit on the program, the function, the organization of space. And I think this is really important because, again, I don't think style should really be the main mode of organizing Cairo's architectural history, given that style is really quite, one way to say it is it's quite muddled in a place like Cairo, or I would highlight it by saying that it's actually quite eclectic and it mixes quite a lot of influences and references that really make style not the most essential lens through which to tell the story of Cairo's architectural production. So 17 sections of different geographic zones within the city. And again, the inclusion of buildings regardless of style, regardless of function. And I think perhaps one of the first questions that was sent for this live event was about the selection of buildings. How did we select the buildings? Before I go further, this is probably a good time now that enough people have tuned in to say that this book was only possible thanks to a team of young researchers, and I'm very grateful to all of them. They're all young architecture students in Cairo who were very enthusiastic when I called for contributions or for help for building a research team to work on this book. And so thanks to them, and particularly to Hala Higazi, who sort of was the project manager and really handled all the details. So thanks to them. And what we did as a team is canvass the city, identify buildings that are of architectural interest that fall between the time frame of 1900 to the present. Once this was done, there was a sort of a process of elimination and information gathering. So we needed to not only include a building because it is architecturally interesting, but to try to use this as an opportunity to fill in some missing information, such as the name of the building, who the architect was, but also why the building is interesting or significant for us as architects, but also as non-architects to consider each individual building as a fundamental part of the city's history. So in many cases, information was relatively easy to find, and those cases tend to be the buildings constructed, let's say from the 1930s to the 1970s, when a lot of architects published their work, which means that we have some scholarly sources that we can identify, that we can use to identify who the architect was, what the ideas were, what the challenges were, who the client is. But most architects actually did not publish, despite the fact that Egypt had a very rich architectural publishing activity from the 1930s to the 1960s. The publishing culture around architecture really decreased significantly by the end of the 1950s, the end of the 1950s, as the government sort of took more control of the press. Al-Imara magazine, which is a very important and primary source for this book, many of the buildings built during the period when the magazine was being published from 1939 to 1959 was really one of the few platforms that allowed Egyptian architects, a select group of them who were friends with the publisher of the magazine, architect Said Karim, to be included in this publication and to sort of circulate their work. But many other architects did not publish their work, which makes it really difficult to track down the architect and so on. So by process of elimination, by trying to find out as much information as possible, but also trying to see what buildings we can get photographs for, which is another key and critical point to highlight, which is the difficulty of photography in Egypt today. So also on this point, I probably should thank all the photographers whose work and images appear in this book. There's about a dozen different photographers who've contributed images that were really fundamental to make this book happen. In many cases, the buildings are inaccessible, or they are covered with trees. They're guarded with a very malicious web. You never know what happens, but the situation really with photography and architecture in Egypt today is it's quite difficult. Also, with a general sort of ban on photography, with photography seen as suspicious. Without photography, documented architecture is really difficult. In some cases, we do have archival sources, such as the archives at the American University in Cairo and the Special Collections Library at the university, which holds the papers of 5 important architects. Those are, of course, again, 5 out of several dozens of significant architects, let alone the many others who were sort of second tier or, doing less, let's say, more popular work or more available work. So there's really very limited access to information. But this all highlights why a book like this is really important, because given, of course, the current circumstances with COVID-19, and I hope everyone watching is healthy and feeling well. And I want to say also hello to everyone watching from everywhere else around the world, not just in Cairo. It's really interesting. We can hold an event at a venue and maybe, we get 25, 30 people, but here it's kind of from all over the world. And I think it's quite a fascinating way to deal with this pandemic and how to stay active during it. But the pandemic will also be cover for a lot of illegal acts of demolition, which has always spiked in Egypt during unusual times. In 2011 and the following years, the lax security situation has caused the demolition of really hundreds of buildings that were not documented before they were demolished. Most likely they were demolished illegally. And so I hope that during this current circumstances that Cairo's architectural heritage, or what's left of it, will survive. So maybe this is a good time to take some of the questions. Please feel free to comment with any questions. I'm just gonna look over what I have here so far. So trying hard to watch, but post iftar internet. I hope your post iftar internet is not too bad. And happy Ramadan. Hello from Mexico City, favorite city. Please stay online with us. Have something to say about Mexico. Okay, so first question that I have that were previously sent before the live event is about Kuwait. So the question was, do you think that the years you spent in Kuwait as a child shaped your architectural sensibility and partly explain your keen interest in modern architecture? I've mentioned this many times, on different occasions. I think that yes, I grew up in Kuwait the first 10 years of my life, in the 1980s, and this period is very formative for me and for my interests in architecture. Kuwait was quite an exciting landscape for modern architecture in the 1980s. A lot of Egyptian architects had already established some sort of practice in the Gulf in general, but specifically in Kuwait, as it was one of the earlier countries to sort of establish new urban foundations and to create institutions that would commission architects to build basically new housing, new government buildings, and so on. And with the decline of the situation in Egypt in the 1960s and 70s, many architects, including Said Karim, but he did it a bit earlier, established some sort of practice in the Gulf. And Kuwait was one of those places where you can see the work of several Egyptian architects, but others as well. including international architects. The most perhaps iconic images from Kuwait in the 1980s are the water towers on the Corniche, but also a wide variety of other water towers that were quite sculptural and iconic, but also the municipality building and so on. So Kuwait was really an important formative experience for me, but also the going back and forth between Kuwait and Alexandria, where also quite an important presence of modernist architecture was still there in the 1980s, much of which has been demolished since. And Alexandria is another city that really requires a book like this, but it might actually be quite difficult to produce a book like this about Alexandria, because in many ways it's been under a much more intense attack on modern architecture, because it's the easiest to demolish, it's the latest, it's the one that's not really protected. Protection laws in Egypt are really quite lax and have many loopholes. And Alexandria's limited geography has meant that much of its interest in architecture that could be considered for heritage, especially modern ones, have already been demolished. But we'll talk about preservation in a second. It's another one of the questions. Is it available at any bookstore in Beirut? It should be at Antoine in Beirut, I believe, Antoine bookstores. And I believe if you can order online in Beirut, then you should be able to also find the book on Amazon or other online outlets. But I know that Antoine in Beirut has copies or has ordered copies. So back to what I was saying about Kuwait and the Gulf. I think there's quite a really interesting relationship between modernism and the Gulf emerging from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and sort of the dwindling modernist production that's happening in places like Beirut and Cairo, and of course Baghdad. And so one of my interests is really to link this experience of modernism in Egypt to its broader regional context. Let's see, why is Cairo's architectural landscape so unique? So in many cases, one can say that every big city has unique features, but also there are conditions that are shared by cities that sometimes have quite different geographical, historical contexts, yet they somehow have similar experiences. And I think on the one hand, yes, Cairo can be said it's unique because of its historical development, the fact that it includes remnants from so many overlapping cultures and historical moments in quite close proximity. But I would say it's unique because of the kind of development that has been caused since World War II. And the transformations of the city since World War II has really gone off on a tangent that probably isn't completely unique. I'm sure there's other cities around the world that have this kind of particular condition, but it's a condition in which population growth is uncontrolled and is explosive, yet the profession has completely declined. Municipal conditions are pretty poor. There's no democratic elections for the municipalities. And this mixture has really produced quite an unusual, I would say, unique urban condition, which is probably why many universities in Europe are starting to send their students to Cairo, such as ETH in Zurich, and I believe it's the Technical University in Berlin, the university, what's it called? There's an architecture school in Stuttgart that's been sending students to Cairo to really consider and take seriously these conditions that have produced this urban environment, which I would say is really a hint at what the future of cities might look like. And I know this is a bit counter what we think, because we have this sort of fantastical idea that the future is very high tech and is very sleek. But I think more and more parts of the world in the near future will resemble sort of the very complex conditions that one sees in Cairo, the way capital moves, the way populations are sort of moved from one part of the city to another to make room for certain kinds of developments. the way architecture is constantly changing, the way heritage laws create a condition in which people want to get rid of their heritage buildings. And we've seen many examples just in the recent weeks, again, because of the pandemic and the unusual circumstances in the middle of the night. The active clandestine network of building destroyers, I would call them, are quite active, and their methods of destroying buildings based on the request of their owners include flooding foundations, digging under the foundations, injecting acid into structural elements so that the building just sort of collapses on itself and therefore gets a demolition permit. That's unique. I've never really heard about such efforts growing so far in a city to destroy itself, to cannibalize itself. So I would say this is generally one of the things that really make Cairo's architectural landscape quite unique, because it has so much to offer, yet it's being so undermined so intensely. And I think that really is a unique condition. What were some of the biggest challenges you faced working on the book? So research in Egypt is not easy. I think this is not a secret. Access to archives is quite difficult, especially ones in state control. The state sees archives as, or information really in general, as national security, which means that if I want to write about the history of the architecture of, let's say, state infrastructure, this would be seen as kind of a difficult, hospitals, schools, for example. I recently did an installation that was part of the Sharjah Architectural Triennial that looked at the architecture of public schools in Egypt in the 1950s. And it's really shocking that access to that kind of information is almost impossible. Besides what I can find in published sources, and really what's been already made public out there just needs to be collected, sorted, and analyzed. But access to additional information from the state side, the state doesn't really want to speak about itself and its history, specifically its recent history. So research in Egypt is quite difficult. Access to archives, photography is difficult. These are all very challenging things. I would say a book like this is fundamental for every city. But the conditions in those different cities in terms of research and feasibility of producing this kind of work really can lead to drastically different versions of this book in different places. In some places you might have access to a lot more photography, a lot more municipal information. We can know exactly the chain of who's owned this building since it was first built. There are regulations that keep track of every change that have happened to the building in some places. So writing this kind of history with that kind of information accessible is really different. So here we're a little bit also really kind of moving in the dark, trying to piece together what can be pieced together from the so little available information and images and so on. And keeping in mind that so much has already been lost. So I would say those are some of the most difficult challenges. Let me take another question from what's coming up here. If not, perhaps via the Arab Center for Architecture. Yes, this is probably also a good shout out to the Arab Center for Architecture, which is based in Beirut. The Arab Center for Architecture was established by George Arbid and a group of other academics and architects in Beirut, and it's trying to really create an institution that's fundamentally important for not only Beirut, but really the Arab world, and which is an institution that has its own archive of original documents from architects. Most of what they have in their collection right now is from Lebanese architects. Egypt doesn't have really an institution of the kind, mostly because it's quite difficult given the current circumstances to establish, let's say, an NGO. Good luck. No funding, no research, it's not happening. But I think it's really an important organization, the Arab Center for Architecture. There have been other different organizations, few across the Middle East, that have sort of tried to establish themselves as focusing on the Arab region and architecture in the Arab region. The most recent is the Sharjah Architectural Triennial. But I think there's a lot more work to be done to really create an inclusive community that genuinely is interested in the regional aspects of architectural production and the narratives around those and the networks within the region. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the efforts seem to be much more interested in sort of appeasing Western eyes, impressing Western eyes, sort of joining a conversation that's not really ours in many ways by not really focusing on our very unique and special circumstances. So a lot more work needs to be done. I hope that one day we can see an organization established in Egypt, such as the Arab Center for Architecture, that can really collect and make accessible and create a public space for the community to celebrate architecture and work on it. I think I got a question here about a specific church. Let me see. Interesting. So I'd like to ask a question about this Shubra section. Was considered at some point to include Roman Catholic Cathedral. Ah, yes. Okay. So this is really important. Can I actually see a picture of the cathedral? So the question is about this particular cathedral. It is called, it's a Roman Catholic Cathedral of St. Mark in Shubra. I actually honestly don't know much about it. And this is one of the challenges of doing this kind of work. I would say this kind of work is usually cumulative. You build on other people's work as you compile something like this. But I think given the circumstances, you know, a place like Shubra deserves a book that's this big, that's 400 pages. And I would say what's really important for people to remember is that this was never meant to be the only list of buildings in Cairo that deserve to be studied or considered for their architectural contribution or history. This is only a list based on what we were able to conduct as a team. Shubra, Maadi, many of those areas included in the book can have many examples. So I don't know too much about the specific building, but one of my hopes with this project is that everybody gets sort of energized to document buildings like St. Mark's that were not part of the book and publicize them, put them on your blog, tweet about them, post it on your Facebook. There's many Facebook users. I would name, for example, Michelle Hanna, who I would recommend for people to follow, who post constantly about architecture and architectural heritage, specifically what's being lost in their vicinity, in their neighborhood. And I would say this kind of circulation of information and images and curiosity, you know, Michel Hanna is a pharmacist, he's not an architect. And I think this is really what's exciting, is how people who are not necessarily, you know, eating, living, sleeping, thinking about architecture become interested in architecture and talking about it and circulating it. So, so thank you for your question about St. Mark's. We have a few more minutes. I'll try to hit a few of the questions that were previously sent. So, in one reviewer for Architectural Digest wrote that the book is safeguarding the architectural history of Cairo. How is this important? I think I already touched on this. I think what I'd like to just remind people is that let's move away from the idea that architecture is about beauty. Architecture primarily is about function and use. And also, it's really important to think about questions of identity and to remember that identity is a process, and architecture can be one of the ways in which identity shows and expresses itself visually, architecturally, and spatially. But often the most successful architectural specimens that do this, when we look back at them, you know, after they were built by a generation or two, are the ones that didn't intentionally try to design an identity, the ones that sort of reflect or express an identity without it being a sort of a singular vision by the architect or the patron. And I think this is what's really important, to think about these buildings as many conflicting sometimes, but parallel in other times, expressions of identity, but also these buildings are evidence of social, political, cultural, and many other forces that shape our built environment, municipal conditions, political conditions. So I just want to encourage people to think of buildings as pieces of historical evidence that tell us about us as a society, wherever we are, as opposed to think of architecture merely as a few pretty or beautiful buildings that sort of dot our urban landscape to decorate it. And so we have this and unfortunately, I think in Cairo, we have a very shallow understanding of what from the modern period should be protected. And that's an idea about beauty. I think this was one of also the questions that was sent to me, which is about, so there was a question about pharaonic architecture, how it seeped into modern architectural identity. I think the examples in the book that might be relevant for this question about pharaonic architecture, there is one, there's several, but let's say the Saad Zaghloul Mausoleum is the most obvious. Early 20th century effort to utilize ancient Egyptian heritage in a sort of a neoclassical or neo-historical style to sort of create a national style. Of course, the Saad Zaghloul Mausoleum was very controversial at the time because of identity being right at the center of this debate. Do we build a mausoleum for a national hero that is neo-Islamic in style or neo-ancient Egyptian in style, neo-pharaonic in style? And those were the debates at the time. And of course, the end result was a neo-pharaonic style. I would say that interpretation or use of ancient Egyptian architecture in the construction of modern architectural identity has a global context. All around the world, neo-historical approaches were happening. Egypt in the 19th century, there was a lot of efforts in Egypt in the 19th century to document and record historical architecture. And within a generation or two, those documentations became sources for new sort of attempts to construct an identity. I just want to find the building really quick. It's here. So this is one example. The very same architect, Mustafa Fahmi, also designed other buildings that utilize different sources for identity, such as his, I'm trying to find it here. Well, Neo-Mamluk is often sort of the other go-to reference, but often the buildings that are eclectic in their aesthetic choices that refer to a certain identity from the past, they never really do it in the way they would have done in the past. You would see a dome from one source and then a cornice from a completely different source and a doorway from a third source. And I think this is what makes these buildings really quite exciting, is that they don't really adhere to a very, let's say, purist idea of style. And instead, they, in a very free way, combine elements from a variety of sources. What's another question that I have? Let's see. Oh yeah, there was, because we're almost out of time, I think there's a really important question about preservation that I want to get to before I go to my final questions. I think it's really important to think about the current moment and how architecture relates to it. Unfortunately, in many cases, architecture is seen as this frivolous endeavor. But I think it's really important to think of preservation as fundamental for the stability of a society. And so restoration needs a complete ecosystem. And so the question that was sent previous to the live chat was, is it possible to restore Cairo? So this is a question that's on a lot of people's minds, but what I want to highlight using this question is that restoration is a complete environment. You need an architectural profession that is trained from the very beginning to deal in a very sensitive way with the existing urban fabric. And this is fundamentally important in historical contexts and cities that have ancient histories. It's very different. You cannot be trained as an architect at the American University in Cairo in the same way you're trained as an architect at, let's say, the American University of Sharjah. The contexts are immensely different. And unfortunately, architectural education and practice in Egypt is really not geared towards dealing with what already exists. Great examples of places where this happens, where the architectural profession is very much geared towards existing buildings, let's say Portugal, Spain, Mexico. These are places that have really excelled in making the most out of the existing built environment. And I think the result really shows on those cities. When you visit Lisbon, when you visit even Mexico City. You really, your Airbnb is most likely going to be in a 200-year-old house with crooked floors, yet it has like a modern kitchen and bathroom. And this combination, the ability to do this sensitively, to maintain a building that may seem like it's normal, like it's not important, like it's not unique, most likely because it's a residential building. The ability to transform this into an active income generating protected structure is really difficult, and the whole system really needs to be geared towards this. So I would say overhaul architectural education in Egypt as soon as possible, and really make preservation and the ability to reuse professionally existing buildings a priority. And this is because buildings are resources, they're limited resources. Oh, of course, Morocco, thank you for that. Morocco is a great example for this. In the region. So I think, or in the broader North Africa, West Asia sort of region, Morocco is a great example for adaptive reuse and a profession that's able to do this. I just wanted to say, besides that, laws and regulations need to be entirely revisited. We've lost already the ability to maintain entire urban fabrics in Egypt. There's not a singular urban spot that I can stand in Egypt and see all 360 all around me a preserved environment. So that might not be necessarily a bad thing, because I don't think we need to replicate Western notions of preservation that were ignited by sort of World War II destruction of European cities. I don't think we need to necessarily replicate this. We need to come up with our own, but there really needs to be, as soon as possible, a complete environment that encourages preservation and restoration in a very successful and integrated way, that does not fence off buildings, that does not only look at grand architecture or the architecture of the elite, and that does not turn every heritage-worthy building into a museum. This is obviously a very failed endeavor. So final question that I have is, any plans for future books similar to Cairo Since 1900? So in the last several years, I was interested in doing a book on Alexandria that would probably follow a slightly different format, less of an architectural survey / guide, but more of an urban guide that includes architecture and a focus on architecture. So Alexandria is sort of a project that started on and off for the last several years, and I still have to see what I can do with it. But similar books, I'm also really interested right now. I've been working for the last several months using the quarantine and the time off to look at contemporary architectural practices by medium to small sized offices based in North Africa and West Asia, to see what architects since 2000 are doing today in this region. And this is as a sort of effort to collect regional architectural experiences that are contemporary, that are also separate from the overwhelming presence of large international corporations and architectural firms that are really shaping places like, let's say, the Gulf. The presence of foreign offices is quite heavy. Places like Egypt, that's not the case. There are SOM is there. Foster will do a competition for a project in Egypt, but they're not really present in the same way. And I think small-scale architectural interventions by locally based offices are doing really interesting things that I'd like to sort of collect together into a book. So Alexandria since 1900, not quite. I'd like to look at Alexandria in a more complete way that includes its entire history. I mean, one of the things that really fascinate me about Alexandria is that it's a city that's really shaped by a history of demolition. It's because of its limited geography. Every layer sort of replaces the one before it. So it's kind of like a thick cake of many slices. And we always get to see the most recent surface. Of course, not everything when it's demolished leaves archaeological remains. So anyway, Alexandria is a different monster that I'd like to work on, but probably using a slightly different format than the one we did for Cairo Since 1900. Any other questions? I think I've covered almost everything. Just a reminder for everyone, CairoSince1900.com, information about the book. There's an exhibition that was set to open at the New York Center for Architecture what was it, 26 March. Now it feels like almost, but since, of course, the current pandemic made it very clear that nothing like exhibitions can happen anytime soon. The exhibition is currently postponed until we are able to host such events. But this will be at the Center for Architecture. The exhibition is titled Cairo Modern, and it is really an exhibition based on the book, 20 examples from the book, built from the 1930s to the 1970s, half of which have been demolished already, which is an important issue that the book is trying to raise. Besides that, you can buy the book anywhere around the world. Here, this is my sales pitch before I go. It's available on Amazon, and if you don't like Amazon, which I completely understand, support your local bookstores by having them order it directly from the publisher. But the book is available everywhere around the world. And in Egypt, AUC Bookstores is doing deliveries for free anywhere in the country. So contact AUC Press on their Facebook page or AUC Bookstores on their Facebook page. And yeah, you can get the book. I think it's free everywhere in Cairo, but they deliver everywhere in Egypt anyway. So you can let them know where you want it delivered, and they'll let you know what that costs. So everybody, please stay safe. Take care of yourselves first, but also your architecture, where you live, and your neighborhood. Keep your eyes out. I think Cairo is going through some really difficult times, and it is really going to be up to everyday people who keep an eye out on what's happening around them, documenting interest in buildings, because they may disappear quickly. And so even a picture that you take with your cell phone of a building that you thought was interesting in your neighborhood, one day that picture might actually end up being the only piece of evidence that that building ever existed. So take care of yourselves, take care of your cities. Cairo Since 1900, an architectural guide, AUC Press 2020. Thank you so much for tuning in. And keep sending your questions. We'll try to respond to them. So thank you very much.